Welcome to the UEA London Lecture. I'm Colin Cooper. I'm the Professor of Cancer Genetics and Associate Dean of Research, Faculty of Medical Health Science at the University of East Anglia. I'm delighted to see so many alumni, friends, even potential students here this evening, and a very warm welcome to those joining us by the live stream. Before I introduce the lecture, a little bit of housekeeping. I'd like to make a small request to you. We'll be sending a brief survey by email, and if you could fill that in, it'd be really helpful to improve future lectures. Those of you who are on Twitter, you can tweet your thoughts on hashtag UEA Live Lecture. For the benefit of those that are new to these lectures, they last about 45 minutes, then you can then ask questions. And finally, we'll have a drink in the foyer outside. Now, I'm very pleased to say that our Vice-Chancellor, David Richardson's here today. Hi, David. And he'll be, if you've got any awkward questions, you can ask him. Don't ask me, ask David later. He's the guy that can tell you all about the university. Now to introduce our lecturer. Anne-Marie is Professor of Nutrigenetics and Head of Nutrigenetics Group in the Department of Nutrition and Preventative Medicine at UEA's Norwich Medical School. Anne-Marie's just finished her term as Director of Research and Innovation in the school, and I think it's true to say she's completely transformed the research environment and success there. In the last 18 months, we've had 4 Lancet papers, a New England Journal of Medicine paper, British Journal of Medicine paper, all in the epidemiology area in which Anne-Marie is going to talk about tonight. Now, the med school is divided into 3 themes: life course and aging, cardiometabolic and health, gut health, and public health and health services, and aims to make scientific breakthroughs in mechanisms of disease, identifying treatments and prevention, and also improving health services. Now, the Nutrigenetics Group, which Anne-Marie leads, specifically investigates the impact of N3 fatty acids and common gene variants on cardiovascular health. More recently, research has been focused on age-related cognitive health and Alzheimer's disease risk. A large proportion of the group's research involves human intervention trials, but they also use wild-type and transgenic models, cell systems in vitro, and other systems to investigate underlying mechanisms. Anne-Marie has published over 140 scientific papers, and away from UEA is Deputy Director of the British Journal of Nutrition and Academic Advisor for the International Life Sciences Institute. Now, we already know that what's good for your heart is good for your brain, and Anne-Marie is going to show you some of the proof to that this evening. In 2017, Anne-Marie led a successful bid to Alzheimer's Research UK with Newcastle, Aberdeen and Birmingham to fund a project called MedX. They were awarded £760,000 to conduct a trial aiming to boost the adoption of Mediterranean-style diet, which obviously can't be bad, and increase physical activity in older adults with a view to improving cardiovascular phenotype and ultimately cognition, and potentially preventing or delaying dementia. As part of this project, the team is also analysing medical records from 9,000 adults from 2 previous studies. In a lecture tonight, Anne-Marie will share some of her early findings of the exciting MedX project and what is known in relation to nutrition, brain vitality and dementia risk. Please join me with a big welcome for Professor Anne-Marie Minihane.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much, Colin, for that introduction. Welcome to you in the audience and welcome to the folks who are joining us online. So over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to meander through these topics here on the screen. And I hope by the end you'll kind of realise that they're not just individual topics, but that they're very much connected and that there's a thread running through. So you look quite an exceptional audience, but even with an exceptional group of people, after about 20 minutes, if we're focused on the one element of cognition, it tends to wane. Attention tends to wane after about 20 minutes. So after halfway through my lecture, I'm just going to focus a little bit and get us to do what's called the MEDAS questionnaire. And that's just to see how well we as individuals adhere to a healthy Mediterranean diet. So just a little break from proceedings. So we'll begin with the concepts of lifespan and healthy lifespan, and the need to very much consider these two things in unison. Now, throughout the majority of human history, lifespan has been considerably less than 50 years. So in 1900 in the UK, average lifespan at birth in males was 44 years, and in females was 48 years. Over the last 150 years or so, we've seen exceptional increases in life expectancy at a rate of about 2 to 3 years every decade. So today, life expectancy at birth in the UK is 79 years in males and 83 years in females. Now, what have been the reasons for this? The main reason is that infant mortality in the first year has plummeted, absolutely plummeted. The second reason is we're aging better. And our ability to monitor health, to monitor risk of disease, to monitor disease when it happens, and our ability to prevent and treat disease is better than it's ever been before. So this increase in life expectancy has undoubtedly been a tremendous societal and public health achievement. But it does bring its challenges. And associated with this achievement, of course, is very much an aging population demographic. So currently, about 15%, you can read for yourself, my pointer doesn't seem to be playing ball, 15% or so of the population worldwide are over 60 years old, and that's predicted, we're back online, that's predicted to increase to about 22% of world population, which will be over 60 years old by 2050. Now, why is this important? Well, of course it's important because when we think of most chronic diseases, age is the major risk factor. And none more so, actually, than when we talk about dementia and Alzheimer's disease. When we get over about the age of 65 years or 70 years, there is an exponential association between age and risk of disease. So if we look here, these are UK statistics produced by Alzheimer's Research UK. So if we look down here at the population at large, we see in 60 to 64-year-olds, about 1 in 100 suffer from dementia. That figure increases to about 11 in 100, or 11%, in the 80 to 84-year-olds. So you can see there's this very sharp association between age and incidence of dementia. Now, the other way to look at it, of course, is we'd be forgiven for thinking these days, with all the focus on brain health and dementia and Alzheimer's, that we're all going to die with dementia. But of course, that absolutely isn't the case. Actually, when you look at the adult population over 65 years, only 7% of the population have dementia. But how do we make sure and up our chances that we're in those 93 out of 100 who don't develop dementia versus the 7 out of 100 who do develop dementia? And that's very much where lifestyle and behaviour come into play. So we all want to live a long time, but of course none of us ever want to get old. And what we should be aiming for, rather than just simply living a long time, we need to be living a long time and healthy. So we need to be adding life to years along with years to life. And I think we can aim a little bit higher than the character Clara in Louise Penny's book, who wished to remain conscious and continent was her new goal. I think we can aim a little bit higher than that. And I would like to aim a little bit more towards the World Health Organization definition of health, which is a complete physical, mental, and social well-being. So that's the kind of definition of health I'd like to be aiming towards. So currently, this is life expectancy, which I mentioned earlier, 79 years for males, 83 years for females in the UK. And that is preceded by a period of ill health. What we don't want to happen is to increase life expectancy, but to also increase this period of ill health. That's not good from a social perspective, it's not good from an individual perspective, it's certainly not good from a health services perspective. What we need to be aiming for is this model here, where we're increasing life expectancy, but we're compressing this period of ill health later in life. And that's where adopting a healthy behaviour and lifestyle throughout life will work towards this kind of model. And of course the focus, I'll be focused very much tonight on nutrition. Now, is there any evidence that this works? Well, there's a lot of evidence this works. And behavioural approaches can lower overall risk of disease by something in the region of 50%, depending on which disease you're interested in. And behavioural approaches can result in improved physical and psychological health, delayed onset and delayed progression of disease, reduced use of medication, and often actually the effect size is greater than any commonly prescribed drugs. And I'll just show you one study which demonstrated that very clearly. It's an old study now, it was published in 2004. And it was conducted in 13 different European countries where they followed people up for 10 years. And they took assessment of people's behaviour at baseline, and then they went on to see who died after a period of 10 years. And you can see they looked at 4 different elements of behaviour: healthy diet, moderate alcohol consumption, physical activity, and being a non-smoker. And you can see that if you are on the healthy end of each of these spectrums, you reduced your risk of death by anywhere between 20 and about 40%. If you had a healthy diet, a moderate alcohol consumption, exercise regularly, and didn't smoke, you reduced your risk of death over those 10 years by a very impressive 70%, I have to say. Now, this isn't a new thing. This fellow here, you might recognize him, he's Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. He lived actually till he was 90, so he knew what he was talking about, and he lived a very long time ago. But he very famously said, that everybody, if they have the right amount of nourishment and exercise, not too much or not too little, it's the safest way to health. So this concept of behaviour and health is not a new one. We're just beginning to refine it now, we hope. So the second bit I'd like to go on to is, we're moving now into the brain areas, just to give us a little bit of background on brain health, brain, Alzheimer's disease, that type of thing. So the basic functional unit of the brain is the neuron, the brain cell. There's other types of cells in the brain, but this is the main type of cell in the brain. And we have about 100 billion of these. So we have quite a few. And this is what a neuron looks like. It's got a cell body. It's got these extensions called dendrites, these areas called axons, and these regions called synapses. And this region here is magnified here, and this is where different neurons communicate with each other. Now, what happens, of course, when we start to lose cognitive function is the functionality of the cell begins to decline, and also neurons begin to die off. So I have a little video clip here, which I hope will work, which is just 4 minutes, which is a video clip from the National Institute of Health in the US, which just talks a little bit about neurons and their role in brain health and their role in the development of Alzheimer's disease. So let's hope this works for us. Now we'll warn you, it's a bit loud.
And hope.
Hello, everyone.
That's not it. Okay, let's try again. We're in business.
In healthy people, all sensations, movements, thoughts, memories, and feelings are the result of signals that pass through billions of nerve cells or neurons in the brain. Neurons constantly communicate with each other through electrical charges that travel down axons, causing the release of chemicals across tiny gaps to neighboring neurons. Other cells in the brain, such as astrocytes and microglia, clear away debris and help keep neurons healthy. In a person with Alzheimer's disease, the most basic form of dementia, toxic changes in the brain destroy this healthy balance. These changes may occur years, even decades, before the first signs of dementia. Researchers believe that this process involves two proteins, called beta amyloid and tau, which somehow become toxic to the brain. It appears that abnormal tau accumulates, eventually forming tangles inside neurons. And beta amyloid clumps into plaques, which slowly build up between neurons. As the level of amyloid reaches a tipping point, there is a rapid spread of tau throughout the brain. But tau and beta amyloid may not be the only factors involved in Alzheimer's. Other changes that affect the brain may also play a role over time. The vascular system may fail to deliver sufficient blood and nutrients to the brain. The brain may lack the glucose needed to power its activity. Chronic inflammation sets in as microglial cells fail to clear away debris and astrocytes react to distressed microglia. Eventually, neurons lose their ability to communicate. As neurons die, the brain shrinks, beginning in the hippocampus, a part of the brain important to learning and memory. People may begin to experience memory loss, impaired decision-making, and language problems. As more neurons die throughout the brain, a person with Alzheimer's gradually loses the ability to think, remember, make decisions, and function independently. Achieving a deeper understanding of the molecular and cellular mechanisms and how they may interact is vital to the development of effective therapies. Much progress has been made in identifying various underlying factors. Advances in brain imaging allow us to see the course of plaques and tangles in the living brain. Blood and fluid biomarkers are providing insights about when the disease starts and how it progresses. More is also known about the genetic underpinnings of the disease and how they can affect particular biological pathways. These advances enable the development and testing of promising new therapies, including drugs that reduce or clear the increase of tau and amyloid proteins in the brain, therapies targeting the vascular system, glucose metabolism, and inflammation, and lifestyle interventions like exercise or diet, and behavioral approaches like social engagement that may enhance brain health. Research is moving quickly, ever closer to the day when we can delay or even prevent the devastation of dementia.
Good, so we'll cover some of those elements in the remainder of the lecture. So just to get our terminology straight, dementia is very much an umbrella term. There's often a confusion between the term dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Dementia is very much an umbrella term which describes a range of symptoms associated with cognitive impairment. The main form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, so about 2/3 of people who have dementia have the Alzheimer's disease form. And interestingly, which I'll come back to later, about 2/3 of patients with Alzheimer's disease are women, which is something we haven't quite got a handle on the reason for that yet. The definition on top is, cognitive decline, the definition on the top is what we mean by cognition. So that's the Oxford Dictionary definition of cognition. And it involves a number of intellectual processes listed here. And these can be basically summarized as our ability to recall knowledge and our ability to create new knowledge. Now, what are risk factors for dementia and Alzheimer's disease and cognitive decline? Well, age we've already mentioned, sex we've referred to briefly. I'd now just like to mention one other before I go on to behaviour, and that is ApoE genotype, and that's a genotype we do a lot of work on in my group in Norwich. About 60% of you here in the audience have got an E3 genotype. About 6 out of 10 people have that genotype. If you've got that genotype and you develop Alzheimer's disease, you usually get Alzheimer's disease on average by age 84. If you're an E4 carrier, which is about 25% of you here in the audience, and you get Alzheimer's, it tends to be slightly younger, and your risk of getting it is 4-fold higher. If you're double E4, which is about 2% of the population, your age of onset is about 16 years younger, and your risk is 16-fold higher. So it's a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Now coming on to the main crux of the talk, nutrition and brain health. Now I'll just take a break for 1 second and get you to just finish off your questionnaires or start your questionnaires if you haven't started them already. And this will be a backdrop for the second half of the talk. This is a questionnaire which is widely used to assess the quality of people's diet and to see how adherent you are to a Mediterranean-style diet. And there's 14 questions in total. If you answer yes, you give yourself 1. If you answer no, you give yourself 0. So the first question, for example, do you use olive oil as your culinary fat? If the answer is yes, give yourself a 1. So if you just want to take a couple of minutes to go through the questionnaire, I don't have any prizes if you get 14 out of 14, but I've never seen it in any audience before, so it will be very exceptional. So we won't spend too long on this, but you might like to take it away with you, and because there's some notes afterwards as well. Now the second question, 200 grams of vegetables, is a great big whopping portion of vegetables, I have to say. The typical UK portion is 80 grams. So this is a questionnaire designed in Mediterranean countries. And when you go on to the second part, and there's a question here about, do you eat poultry more than red meat? If you're a vegetarian or vegan, you give yourself a 1, obviously, for that question. So if you don't have a pen, you can just go through and estimate what your score is. I won't tell you what my score is, but it's nowhere close to 14, that's for sure. Okay, we'll start on the low end. Did anybody score 0? Did anybody score 14? Did anybody score 10 or above? Oh, I'm impressed. I am impressed. That's a good diet. That's a good diet. So we will use this score later in the talk, so you can keep this score in mind. So when we talk about nutrition strategies for cognition and Alzheimer's disease, we can do it at 3 levels. We can talk about individual food components, we can talk about composite foods and medicinal foods, or we can talk about dietary patterns and whole diets. And I'll specifically refer to the Mediterranean diet tonight when I'm talking about that. Over the course of decades, it is likely that if you have a higher level of an individual food component, it will be cognitively beneficial. If you intervene in the short term and you're hoping to see an improvement in cognition over the course of 6 months or a year, you need to be thinking whole diet. Individual dietary components are unlikely to do it on their own in the short term. So I'll just speak about 2 of these tonight in the interest of time. I'll talk about flavonoids briefly and also N3 fatty acids. So first of all, flavonoids. You may or may not be familiar with flavonoids. There's about 5,000 of them in the diet. They're derived from plant-based foods. These are the categories of flavonoids, and these are the kind of foods they're found in. They're very much the new kids on the block in nutrition. Very beneficial to cardiovascular health, and we're now beginning to appreciate that they're also beneficial to cognitive health. Most of the evidence so far is for berries and also for cocoa, dark chocolate. And this is just one of the many studies that's now out there on berries, and this is what's called an epidemiological study, an observational study, where you take a history of people at baseline, then you follow them up for 10 or 20 or 30 years, and you see what at baseline predicted whether or not they would go on to develop a particular disease. This was done in a cohort called the Nurses' Health Study. A large group, 16,000 people, were followed over 20 years, took a diet history and baseline, and what they found was that high consumers of blueberries or strawberries, blueberries 1 portion a week, strawberries 2 portions a week, were associated with large cognitive benefits over the follow-up period. And the benefits were equivalent to about 2 years of aging, which is quite impressive. Now N3 fatty acids. So when we talk about N3 fatty acids and cognitive health, we're talking about the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid. The current recommendations are we eat about 0.5 gram of these per day and achieve this by consuming 2 portions of fish per week, one of which should be oily. And these are oily fish, things like herring, mackerel, salmon, fresh tuna, not canned tuna, fresh tuna, and trout. And you can see that if you eat a portion or 2 of these foods per week, you will get about 0.5 gram of EPA, DHA per day. Why is it important to the brain? If you look at the levels of the omega-3 fatty acid DHA in different tissues in the body, you can see it's relatively low, about less than 5% of fat in places like the heart, the muscle, the liver, the red blood cells. Look at the brain, the sperm, and the retina. DHA makes up about 15% of brain lipids. And if you look at this all-important region, the synapses, where neurons talk to each other, DHA makes up about 40% of lipids in that area of the brain. So it's incredibly important for brain health. What does it do? It's involved in making new neurons. We can only do that to a limited extent, but certainly DHA promotes that. It's involved in neuronal survival, neurotransmission, synaptic function, etc. So DHA does a lot of good things in the brain. Also, blood supply to the brain is incredibly important. And we know from work that we've done and other people that actually DHA promotes blood flow. It improves cardiovascular health. This was a study we published a few years ago. So DHA does a lot of good things when it comes to brain health. They're the mechanisms. What's the evidence? Sorry, before we go on to the evidence for DHA, I'd like to introduce to you actually the MEDEX study. So the MEDEX study is something we've embarked on, which we started last year, which is funded by Alzheimer's Research UK. It has 3 projects within it, and it's very much a joint venture. We lead it out of Norwich, but it's very much a joint venture between Norwich, Newcastle, Birmingham and Aberdeen. It's got 3 separate sub-projects, which I'll refer to over the course of this talk. The first of these is called the Aberdeen Children of the 1950s Cohort. And as the name suggested, and we use this cohort to look at the association between cardiovascular health and cognitive health in a UK population. An amazing cohort. This group of people were recruited, 12,000 people recruited in Aberdeen between 1950 and 1956. Here they are recently. They've been followed up in all of that time. Amazing research resource. They look very jolly actually. They look like they're enjoying whatever they're doing there. And in this cohort, as part of the MEDEX project, we've calculated people's cardiovascular risk using a formula called QRIS2. Some of you might be familiar with it. If you go to your GP, it's often used by GPs to see how at risk you are of cardiovascular disease. It involves things like your cholesterol, your blood pressure, whether or not you've got diabetes, your age, etc. And in this particular cohort, the QRIS score was very much related to something called WHT volumes, which is an indication of slight damage to particular brain regions. So very much demonstrating in the UK cohort as part of MEDEX that actually cardiovascular health is very much related to brain health. Now coming back to our N3 fatty acids and cognitive health, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence, if we look at it collectively, is telling us that if we consume between 0.1 and 0.2 grams of DHA per day, we can reduce our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and dementia by as much as 30 to 40%, which is quite a dramatic effect size. And the evidence actually is there's more benefit in women than men. The randomized control evidence is a bit more mixed, I have to say. Some of the trials show benefits, some don't. I think the problem with a lot of the trials is they're too short, and a lot of the trials are done in people who already have either moderate or severe dementia. With fish oils and cognitive health, you need to be getting in there early. Now, this was a study I was part of when I was in New Zealand. I spent a year in New Zealand, 2009 to 2010 at the University of Auckland. And we took a group of young people between the ages of 18 to 45, and we supplemented them with DHA for 6 months. And even over the course of 6 months, we saw very nice improvements in episodic memory. Episodic memory is our ability to recall things from the past. For example, if I could remember every detail of my 10th birthday, which I can tell you I don't, I'd have very good episodic memory. So it's our memory for events from the past. Working memory is kind of, as the name suggests, it's kind of a holding bay for memory. So in this study, we found that even 6 months of intervention with DHA in adults improved both episodic memory and working memory. But the trial evidence is very mixed. Now, just to say, it seems to be that genotype who are E4 seem to have a particular problem with lower levels of DHA in the brain. The evidence is beginning to show. And this is a study we've just finished in Norwich, actually in rodents, where we took rodents who have the human ApoE3 or the human ApoE4 gene. We took male and female rodents at 2 months, 9 months, and 18 months, and we looked at the levels of DHA in the brain. 18 months is about the equivalent to being 60 if you're a human. And what we found is at 18 months we had seen a very sharp decline in DHA in the brain. We found the effect was worse in our E4 rodents. and the greatest effect was if you were E4 and female. So there seems to be a particular problem with depletion of DHA in the brain if you're E4 and female. So this is certainly a group going forward who may particularly benefit from DHA supplementation. Moving on now up the ladder to composite foods and whole diets. The evidence is that it's better, if you're not a vegetarian, to eat your omega-3s as fish rather than as fish oil capsules. There seems to be more of a cognitive benefit. And this study here, it just took data from a lot of cohorts, a lot of very strong cohorts, and it looked at the association between fish consumption and who developed cognitive decline by looking at global cognitive score and memory. Followed people up again for a long period of time. And it found if you consumed more than 4 portions of fish per week, compared to less than 1 portion, it had cognitive benefits equivalent to 4 years of aging, which is very impressive, I have to say. The reason why fish is probably more beneficial than omega-3s by themselves is because fish contains a lot of other things which have shown to have cognitive benefits, in particular oily fish. I don't know if any of you have seen this product called Flavonoid. It's a medicinal food which is purported to improve cognition and brain health. It comes at about £5 a shot. It's not cheap. This is what it contains. And the jury's a bit out, actually. There have been some, it's like a bit like a yogurt shot with these bioactive ingredients. And actually there's some evidence that it might have modest effects on cognition and brain structure. But I have to say the evidence isn't terribly convincing. I think you'd probably be better eating your fish or consuming your Mediterranean diet, in my opinion. So the last level we'll go up to is our Mediterranean diet, one of my chosen favourite subjects these days. What does a Mediterranean diet look like? We kind of think we know, but I'm not sure we always do. So a Mediterranean diet is mainly plant-based. So every meal should contain predominantly plants. Fruits, vegetables, grains. Olive oil should be the main type of oil used in cooking. Lots of pulses, lots of legumes, hardly any salt. No salt at all, actually. The natural flavours or herbs and spices will be where your flavours come from. Fish, 2 or 3 times a week. Meats and sweets a couple of times a month. And modest consumption of things like poultry, eggs, cheese and yogurt. You'll see this little guy popping in here in the back as well. If you are an alcohol consumer, a Mediterranean diet would suggest that you have red wine in modest amounts with your meal, not great bucket loads on a Friday night. So, what's the evidence for a Mediterranean diet? Well, there's this very nice report, which is available free online if you want to download it, from the Department of Health, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition. It says statement, it's a long statement, it's 168 pages, which goes through every element of diet and it's associated with cognition. Very comprehensive report. And this particular report concludes that actually following a Mediterranean diet will reduce your risk, improve cognition, reduce your risk of cognitive decline by a very handsome 20 to 40%. Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, it's just the state of the research. Research to date has been predominantly done in Mediterranean countries. So we know consumption of a Mediterranean diet in Mediterranean countries is associated with cognitive benefits. What about if we adopt this diet in the UK? That's a big question. That's what we've been doing as part of the MEDEX project. So I'll just briefly mention the 2 other elements of our MEDEX project in Norwich. The second sub-project, we're looking at the EPIC Norfolk cohort. A cohort, about 25,000 people, I think, who've been studied in Norfolk since the early 1990s. And we have access to this data as part of the MEDEX project. And we've just submitted a paper for publication where we took over 8,000 of these. This is the first study to comprehensively look at the association between a Mediterranean diet and cognition in a UK population. We've taken 8,000 folks, their data, who've been followed for 15 years. They had 3 different measures of dietary exposure, and we very nicely showed that adherence to a Mediterranean diet was associated with many elements of improved cognition. And if you take your MEDAS score, if you remember your MEDAS score, 14-point scale, a 1-point increase in the MEDAS scale was equivalent to about 0.5 to 1 year of aging. So if you could increase your MEDAS score over a long time by 2, it would be the equivalent of about 2 years of aging on your cognitive health. So yeah, quite very nice to show it in the UK population. And actually we're now going on to conduct an intervention study where we're intervening in people for 6 months just to try and see, can we convince people in the UK to adopt a Mediterranean style diet. We're actually delivering people their foods, and we're asking people to increase their score by 3 units over the course of 6 months. And we're trying to see if we can achieve that within the UK. Now, of course, a Mediterranean style diet is not only good for your health, we also now need to broaden our thinking, and the days of just being able to think of food and health separate from the impact of food and the environment are long gone. We need to be thinking about the diet, environment, health trilemma very much going forward. And this shows currently about 25% of our carbon footprint and greenhouse gases comes from food production and food delivery. This is the increase that's likely to happen by 2050 if the current trajectories continue. If we can adopt a more Mediterranean-style diet, or for that matter a fish-based diet or a vegetarian diet, it will decrease our individual carbon footprint by 30%, 45%, and 55% associated with the food element of our carbon footprint. So it's not only beneficial to health, it is very much where we need to be heading from an environmental perspective as well. This is a very nice report, a summary of which is available online, which talks about, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, Anthropocene. Anthropocene refers to the fact that for the first time in human history, humans are the biggest threat to the planet and human activity. And this report is well worth a read. You can get a summary online. So the last element, which I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about, is it's not only, of course, all about nutrition. I'm a nutritionist, so that's what I'm going to be talking to you about. But there are other elements of behavior which affect cognition. The evidence for physical activity is extremely strong. Actually, the evidence for physical activity on cognition is probably the effect size is greater than the effect size for nutrition. These are the current recommendations in the UK. 145 minutes of moderate intensity or 75 minutes of vigorous activity per week, and 2 sessions of resistant training, things like weights, or doing press-ups or carrying heavy loads or things like that. And these are the kind of things which fit into the moderate and the high intensity categories. So it doesn't have to be organized exercise. It can be very much things we do as part of our normal routine. And really interestingly, the effects of physical activity is even greater if you can combine it with thinking. So things like orienteering, things like exercise classes where you have to think at the same time and follow instructions seems to be particularly beneficial to cognitive health, which is really interesting. A lot of interest in the moment about cognitive training and its effect on cognitive decline. And yeah, there is evidence that cognitive training can improve cognition, particularly the element, so if, for example, you learn a language, it will improve your language skills. If you do cognitive training which focus on working memory, you will improve your working memory skills. The question, the jury is still a bit out, the evidence isn't there actually, it hasn't been done yet, whether that will eventually reduce your risk of dementia. That's the bit of the jigsaw that hasn't been figured out yet. Socialization, really important for cognitive health. Social isolation is very detrimental to cognitive health. So get out there, get laughing. It will improve your cognition. So, closing remarks. Keeping your brain vital. Eat good food, not too much, mainly plants. Plenty of oily fish. Plenty of fish, mainly oily. Keep moving, use your brain, and ideally both at the same time. And stay socially connected. Now the good news is some of these things seem to be working. And I'm going to cognitively stretch us for my last slide. This is evidence from the CFAS study. It's a study which is conducted in Cambridgeshire, Newcastle and Nottingham. And they've taken 2,500 people in between 1989 and 1994 and between 2008 and 2011. And they looked at the incidence of dementia in different age groups in CFAS 1 and CFAS 2, separated by a number of years. And I've just highlighted one particular age group here. You can see in CFAS 1 in men, between 1989 and 1994, about 15% of that age category had dementia. You can see that age category in CFAS 2, there was only 11% of people in that age category with dementia. And you can see very similar decline in women. So the good news is, if you take a particular age category, our incidence of dementia is actually declining. And we can do a lot to influence that by our behaviour. So it just leaves me to thank the people who've sponsored our work in recent years, the group in Norwich who've contributed to the research over the last few years, and the many people we collaborate with. These are some of the people involved in the work I presented to you tonight. These are our collaborators on the MEDEX project at UEA, Aberdeen, Birmingham and Newcastle. And of course, finally and importantly, to thank all our trial participants who've taken part in our work over the last 20 years. And I thank you for your attention.
So it's a very sobering thought, and I think sobering is the right word, that around a third of the diseases you suffer from are due to your behaviour. Alcohol, physical exercise and nutrition right at the top of the list. I think the lecture we've had this evening has been a real illustration of that, and I'm sure that Anne-Marie will be very happy to answer a few questions.
As a community matron, I work a lot with patients with dementia.
Yeah.
And the first thing that they get completely disinterested in is nutrition.
That's right.
And I just wondered if you could give us any pointers about how to get patients interested in becoming involved with having a Mediterranean diet.
Yeah.
What we tend to do is we prescribe patients a lot of nutritional drinks and things, which seems to go against a lot of what you're saying here tonight.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very tricky one, and that probably exacerbates the condition, you know, because, you suddenly find yourself with ill health, and then your behaviour changes, which contributes to your ill health. I mean, there's no magic formula, I have to say. I mean, with the Mediterranean diet, it seems that there's no particular elements, well, we don't know for sure yet, but there doesn't seem to be any particular elements which are more beneficial than others. So I think the thing is to just work with people's food preferences. You know, just rather than trying to do everything, just work with people's food preferences, see what foods people would like and would be willing to include more of in their diets. I mean, with whole foods are always better than these kind of nutrition supplements, but these nutrition supplements work well also. You know, if people have got totally disinterested in foods, particularly things like fruits and vegetables, which are often quite difficult to chew, particularly if eaten raw, I would just advise to work with people's preferences rather than try and dictate too much as to what people should be doing. Yeah.
Hello. You set out very clearly, I'm here, sorry, right at the back.
Yeah.
You set out very clearly the public health and environmental benefits of a Mediterranean diet.
Yeah.
I'd be just interested in your comment that it appears to me that there are very significant commercial and other forces which are acting against that.
Yeah.
When we look at it from a macro level, I just wonder how optimistic you are that over the coming decades we can move to generate the benefits that you described.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem at the moment is it's all working at an individual level. So nutrition is kind of working separately from food and the environment. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to need a major shift in thinking from a government level. You know, it's going to, you know, the framework has to shift completely. You know, we've got the way we tax foods, the availability of foods, all of those things, it needs major thinking. Yeah, little minor changes and tweaks aren't going to work.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I was just wondering about the gut, and where there's a lot of talk now about gut absorption and fermented foods and having a good gut biome.
Yeah.
How does that fit in with your research?
Yeah, I mean, it's just starting to come online. We have done one study actually where we've looked at the effects of ApoE genotype on the gut microbiome, and we found that the ApoE4 genotype did have a different biome from the E3 genotype. I mean, intuitively, there should be a strong influence of gut health and cognitive health. For example, the gut is laden with neurons. There's huge neuronal connectivity between the gut and the brain. So the research is very much work in progress. For example, the gut is a huge modulator of inflammation, systemic inflammation, and we now know systemic inflammation has a large impact on cognitive health. So I think maybe in 5 years' time we'll know more, but there's a huge amount of research activity and likely to be important, very important.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for your talk. I just want to ask about your thoughts on ketosis as a sort of approach to fight Alzheimer's and this kind of link with inflammation.
Yeah.
Particularly, and how that might feed into the amount of carbohydrates that we consume in our diet.
Yeah. I mean, you mean sort of refined versus complex carbohydrates and the whole issue around that?
Or I read Dale Brandison's book on Alzheimer's, and he essentially recommends that we cut out all, by carbohydrates, I mean, I don't know the right term, but like pastries, pastas, grains, breads, which I know feature quite heavily in the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah. I mean, they do feature quite highly, but of course the whole grain form rather than the really refined form. So, I mean, it may seem a bit of a contradiction that the brain makes up about 2% of body weight, but its energy needs are about 25% of total energy needs of the body. The main source of energy is traditionally glucose. So you would think that carbohydrates should be good for brain health. The problem is if we have a lot of refined carbohydrates, it leads to glucose peaks and troughs, which leads to insulin sensitivity, which becomes hugely problematic for the brain. So then the brain starts to have problems of actually utilizing glucose. So I think we know for sure that glucose is necessary for the brain, but we need to be consuming our glucose as more complex carbohydrates rather than these simple sugars or very simple starches.
Hello, thank you for the talk. Just wondering, before we all rush out and top up our extra virgin oil supplies, is there any evidence to suggest that substitutes like rapeseed oil are just as good for you?
Yeah, I mean, the oil comes in all different forms. It does seem to be that the polyphenols, the very small compounds in olive oil, do seem to have added benefits over and above the fatty acids. So something like rapeseed oil has a very nice fat profile. It's very low in saturates, it's very high in monounsaturates, and very high in polyunsaturates, and it's a source of omega-3, even though it's a shorter chain omega-3. So sort of on a fat profile basis, they're probably relatively comparable. It seems to be the extra bioactives in really good quality olive oil which seems to have extra benefits. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about vegetarians and vegans becoming, something becoming very popular.
Yeah.
And I take the point about the fish, eating fish.
Yeah.
But if you're vegetarian or vegan, is there something you could do instead to get the DHA?
Yeah. I mean, there is a vegan form of DHA which is made from marine microalgae. So that is commercially available. So there's vegan and vegetarian DHA. We also have some capacity to make DHA naturally, but it's pretty inefficient. And we can make it from the shorter chain omega-3 called alpha-linolenic acid, and that's found in oils such as rapeseed oil is a good source of alpha-linolenic acid. So I guess if you don't want to go down the supplement route, to consume an oil which is rich in the precursor, something like rapeseed oil would be a good move. And there is evidence coming through now that actually if you're a vegan and a vegetarian, you are more efficient at that biosynthesis process, even though it is so our capacity to make EPA and DHA is very low. The most efficient way of increasing levels in our tissues is to actually consume it. But there is a train of thought coming through that for some reason, and we don't know the reason yet, that following a vegetarian diet does make that process more efficient.
You didn't mention sleep. I read
Yeah.
Matthew Walker's book about sleep.
Yeah.
So he specifically raises, well, he thinks sleep is the key to everything, as you may know, but he specifically mentions that Alzheimer's and sleep, or lack of sleep, are related.
Yeah, I mean, a hugely important point. I think the research is a little bit behind what it is for nutrition, but it's very much coming on stream now, and the evidence that's coming through is hugely supportive for the benefits of sleep and cognition. Sort of in an acute level, which we kind of know intuitively anyway, a bad night's sleep is associated with generally poorer cognition the day after, but also on a chronic level, the evidence is coming through as pretty strong. But it is kind of, the majority of research has been done currently, rather than a huge bulk of published literature yet.
Good evening, thank you very much for the talk. I'm just a little bit curious about if we look at just the Japanese, for example, and they've got a much older population now, and I just want to know your thoughts about the consumption of seaweed in their diet, because if it's something that we should be doing, because we do see it in stores like in a Japanese like fast food outlet like Cohort, there's actually seaweed available.
Yeah. I mean, intuitively, these kinds of products do tend to be full of bioactives, but there isn't a hell of a lot of trial evidence. The composition looks like it should be beneficial, but there isn't trial evidence available to support it or not to support it. Yeah.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm not sure whether I should be impressed or depressed, but...
Not depressed, I hope.
I'm very impressed. But as a mere man, I tend to try and do all this good stuff. I'm quite angelic about food and exercise and everything, but I'm quite a devil when it comes to cooking, because I'm a hefty microwave user, and everyone tells me I just nuke all my food. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we nuke it as much as we think we do. I don't. Yeah, it's well outside my realm of expertise. I don't think there's a hell of a lot of evidence that you will kill off too much of the bioactives if you microwave. I think it's probably worse if you burn your food to death in the oven or something like that, or fry it to death, to be honest. You know, I think there is kind of good evidence that, you know, if you reuse fat and have really burned fat and things like that, that's certainly not a good, barbecuing certainly not good. So, you know, I think compared to some of the traditional practices, actually microwaving probably isn't as bad as we originally thought.
I think we're going to take one or two more questions.
Thanks for the talk. Regarding life expectancy stats and the Mediterranean diet, one would assume that people living in Mediterranean countries would be living significantly longer than Northern European countries, for example. Is this the case?
Do you know it is? I just had an article sent through to me this morning by one of the blue zones called Ikara, an island called Ikara, where they very much follow a traditional Mediterranean style lifestyle. It's not just diet, of course, it's a whole lifestyle. And yeah, there is very much increased longevity in that region. And I went on holiday to an island called Amorgos a few years ago, which is right at the bottom of the Cyclades Islands. And I happened to wander around the graveyard, as you do. And the ages of people on the headstones, I mean, everybody died in their 90s, 100 plus. So I think there is evidence from places that follow a traditional Mediterranean type lifestyle rather than just diet. It is associated with longevity for sure.
Okay, can we have one more question? Well, two questions here. Two questions.
Further to that, are you saying also that, say, in Greece or any other Mediterranean countries, that there's a lower incidence of Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
Not just longevity, but that they're having this disease. There's not as many people getting it. Yeah, I think there is evidence. I mean, there mightn't be the bulk of evidence in that it just hasn't been studied as extensively as it has somewhere in like the US. But yeah, there certainly is evidence. But just to extend from that, it is more than the Mediterranean diet. It is kind of physical activity, conviviality, eating with friends, eating in the sunshine. There is a whole pattern to it, and it seems to collectively contribute to reduced incidence of dementia and sort of better health overall. Okay, thanks.
One last question.
I've really enjoyed your talk as well. I eat a huge amount of vegetables and fruit, and I'm really concerned about the deteriorating quality of them. The fruit and vegetables that you eat, the taste of them in the Mediterranean is just wonderful. And I really think that the taste of the fruit and vegetables mass-produced that you get now in supermarkets has really, really declined, and I'm really worried that actually the nutrition in them is no longer providing really what they should.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. I think that something that's ripened naturally in the sunshine is probably higher in a lot of bioactives than something that's ripened artificially overnight or in a week. So I think you're absolutely right that we need to be concerned not only by the amounts of fruits and vegetables we're consuming, but also the way we produce them before they reach the supermarket shelf. And I don't think there's been enough attention paid to that, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been studied properly, I have to say, but you know, the little bit it has been studied, there is evidence that the bioactive level will be higher when it's grown and produced naturally. Yeah.
So on the point of the glorious thought of living a complete Mediterranean lifestyle, I'm going to end the lecture and invite you all to join us for a drink in the foyer. Thanks for being a great audience. Thank you.